right, hey everyone, happy Tuesday, depending on your time zone. We've got a few things on the agenda today, but before we get started, just want to remind everyone that this is a Kubernetes community meeting. It means just please be nice to each other, abide by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, and just, organizational thing, but also to make sure everyone can get heard. If you do have a comment, please I use Zoom's raise hand feature just so we make sure we can get to everyone. I can also feel free to drop something in chat if that's easier for you. Yeah, with that, I want to kick right off with the 1.1 review because we are getting awfully close, I hope. And, what we were trying to prioritize was experimental GEPs going out. And that part, I think, is very much on track. Huge congrats to Richard for getting gRPC route mostly across the board. The conformance tests have merged. Thank you. This was in large part due to several people confirming that tests are passing. So we had Envoy Gateway, Cilium, and Contour, if I'm remembering correctly, yeah. And yeah, it looks like that was the last thing that was required for this to meet the graduation criteria to go to standard channel. That's going to be fun. And let me talk just a little bit about what that actually means. This is the first time that we're really testing out our theory that we can take API versions and go directly from alpha to V1. And one potential interpretation of that is that there's no point of ever including alpha in the CRDs that we include in standard. I'm not entirely sure about that, but I wrote up a whole thing just trying to get my thoughts on paper about basically what the upgrade process would look like if we didn't include alpha in the standard channel, because like standard channel had no awareness of gRPC route before. So that means that, every form of upgrade, whether you're going from standard to standard, standard to experimental, or experimental to experimental, works great. But as you might expect, going from experimental channel to standard is risky, and if we did this, would just not work at all. Experimental to standard is always remarkably risky because you're going from something that has fields to something that has less things, so you're losing something along the way regardlessly. But so maybe we could say we just don't support this transition, or I've outlined some possible ways we could support this transition with the v1.1 release. I have some ideas, but I just wanted to get this discussion started. If you care about gRPC route, and maybe not even gRPC route, but just our versioning policy as a whole and how we can make this a smooth experience for our users, that feedback, discussion, etc. would be useful here. This is kind of the first time we're going through this path, and yeah, we would like to make sure we get it right. Cool. All right, so just yeah, that's top of the discussions right now. I've been thinking about it some more, may have some additional ideas or workarounds, but if anybody else has dealt with CRDs before, versioning, upgrades, etc., ideas welcome. Cool. All right, the next one is parent ref matching for ports. This one is what I would say at risk, but it really doesn't need to be at risk. I think we have countless implementations that already support this. We just need one of them to sign off, and it's kind of been sitting in this state for a few weeks now. So if anybody out there has an implementation that they know supports parent ref matching, like port in parent ref, please just sign off on the conformance test that yes, this is passing with my implementation, and then this is good to graduate. But we really just need one more, so I've marked this one as at risk. The next one is conformance profiles. Shane, I think you added an update here, but maybe do you want to give a brief overview of
Yep,
what's...
everything's done except for some documentation. We just need a little documentation to help people get to setting theirs up for newcomers. Shouldn't take very long. It is potentially a great opportunity for somebody who wants to get some contributions in because it's all docs, so it's pretty easy. If you understand the basics of how to set it up, if you have an implementation where you've set up conformance tests. If not, Mattia or myself will be grabbing it. I think Mattia said he'd grab it this week if he can. Otherwise, I will be the fallback. So no risk, like we'll get it done. But if somebody does want to jump in and put some docs in, please feel free.
Cool. Okay, so those are the gaps that we know of that are going from experimental to beyond. At least two of them are on track, and hopefully that parent ref one could be, any volunteers on this call, not to put anyone on the spot, but does anybody on this call know that their implementation supports this and would theoretically pass tests related to it? All right, well, we will see. Hopefully it's not too hard to get that last one. All right, so the next one I see, Candace, you're on the call. Client cert validation, well, actually, I don't see Arco, but I think it's all very related. I've been thinking a lot about how on earth our TLS gaps and future will work, because we have a lot of TLS related things that may eventually make it into the API. So I spent some time brainstorming with Nick yesterday on some high level view of the world, how on earth we could make sense of names across all our TLS configuration that might potentially exist in the future. This is, to be clear, this is not at all a commitment that all these things will exist in the API. It's just making sure we have room for them and that the names would make sense if we added them, so we don't have, competing names, inconsistent naming, etc. Like it's possible that we may have config that looks very similar in different places, and we want to make sure that it is named the same thing or close to the same thing wherever possible. So this is our attempt at listing out, basically what we think is the full scope of what could potentially be added to the API. So we've got the idea of client to gateway client cert validation verification. This is Arco's gap. This is likely going to be per listener. And we've proposed maybe this belongs. This is basically what Arco has already proposed, but Arco doesn't have a dot here, which is fine, but there's a chance that we may need client dot something else instead of just client validation. You may want some other form of thing here. So that's one idea. Then we have client to gateway TLS termination. So that's listener.tls. That's unchanging. That's what we already have. We can't change it. Then there's gateway to backend client cert and gateway to backend server cert verification. This last one is what Candace's gap already covers. And we're thinking that maybe this also could benefit from a slight change to be more consistent with what we're doing for client validation in terms of naming. And if we made that change would be a breaking change in v1.1, I think. So yeah, that's a whole lot. Open to ideas, comments, etc. Dave?
Did we also look at the fields in that validation? stuff too, because for example, in I think the server validation for the backend TLS is just like a single host name, but I think, for example, in the listener TLS client validation, then you have, I think, host names, like in or alternate host names, stuff like that. So like,
Yep.
ideally, it'd be nice if they kind of lined up as well.
Yeah, I agree. Yes. Let me write that here. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. This is, I would say, step one of that, just agreeing in that like structs, that the high level areas that things would exist. But I completely agree that we want to make sure. And then that was part of it, was looking at Arco's gap for client validation and saying, well, what we're doing is verifying a cert. And this has an awful lot of similarity between server validation, but also verifying a cert, but in the other direction. So yeah, agree with what you're saying there. Candace?
One thing I wanted to mention was that we should definitely get someone from a mesh viewpoint to weigh in on these changes. And also wanted to just maybe mention that we had named it back in TLS policy to reflect that it was actually a policy, whereas some of these other fields are not policies. And I remember that coming up. Are we backing off from that? I don't think anything else on this list is a policy, but the backend TLS policy is a policy.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that opens another potential can of worms here, which related to the session persistence gap, actually. But let me just say that I've been thinking a lot about where policy belongs in Gateway API itself. Obviously, there is policy for implementation specific things. That's straightforward, whatever. But then there's when Gateway API, the project, chooses to use policy as, its official API. And so far that's been limited to, well, back in TLS policy, but soon to be session persistence as well. And in both cases, that's being used to extend service, right? It's being used to extend an API that we don't have full control over. That it would be very challenging to modify, and even if we could, it wouldn't really make sense. So like, let's say we added L7 constructs to service. They don't really fit because service is fundamentally an L4 thing. So let's say we added TLS validation at that level, like it's not going to make sense to 99% of uses of service. So where that's leading to me on the policy versus built-in configuration is my own bias, and this deserves a larger discussion, but my own bias is to save policy for the times where we don't have an option to provide inline configuration. But when we do have an option to provide inline configuration,
I'm all about
that's
that.
what we should do.
I agree with that bias.
Cool. So yeah, I think like you're completely right, Candace, and I think that's a good thing to point out as a difference, and we should spend some time writing out like if that's a policy of the project policy, but if that's the goal of the project to have that kind of approach to policy attachment, then we should actually write that out so it's less mysterious for future work.
And just to summarize your point, are you thinking of not having that? You're thinking of not having this as a policy, and that's just something we haven't discussed yet because
Oh, no.
because
Sorry
you
for
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Sorry for the confusion. No, I think backend TLS policy has to be a policy forever because we don't have, even if we could modify service, it wouldn't fit on service because service is an L4 construct. So we're stuck. Flynn, yeah, okay, that's fair. But we're basically pushed up against two things. One, service, in my opinion, is primarily an L4 construct. And then two, if we were to make a modification that added L7 constructs there, it would take years to become broadly available. Combining those two things makes me think that a policy is a much better fit here for extending service with L7 concepts like TLS validation. But I would say anywhere else where we have an option to inline configuration directly into APIs, I tend to prefer that.
Okay, thanks.
It's a little weird to me to think of TLS as a layer 7 thing, but that's I think I understand what you're saying, even if that feels a little weird to me. Yeah. Mike Morris put a comment about mesh use cases and TLS stuff, and I will chime in pretty much agreeing with what Mike is saying. In a lot of ways, meshes work best when you're not trying to have services deliberately speak TLS to each other and you just leave that to the mesh and let it be automagic. So I think that this kind of thing where we want to explicitly talk about the gateway configuring clients when configuring the TLS client to talk to the backend, I think that's likely to work better when you're not using a service mesh anyway. So I don't really have a problem with much of this, or I don't really have a problem with this from the mesh perspective.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah. I'm a little interested in some of these Yagni things, but not interested enough to think we should spend a lot of time in the meeting talking about that, because I tend to agree that to the extent we can avoid configuring TLS stuff, we should.
Yeah. Yeah, this is really just trying to think of any possible place something might fit and making sure our names leave room for it. That's all. This is far from a commitment to do any of these things, just making sure we have room for them.
Mike, were you gonna say that I got your comment wrong?
No. You mostly covered it. I just wanted to add context on two specific cases where we do have a need for integrating things with mesh, possibly using this functionality. And I think that there's already been prior discussions about like the one gap identified here in terms of what certificate is used to initiate things from like gateway as client. But basically, there is a use case for a cloud ingress of some sort where you can't reasonably deploy a sidecar next to it. So a way to configure that to directly talk MTLS to an in-mesh backend. It's possible that could be like configured in some automated way by the mesh, but like for the purposes of generic things that is external to the mesh, it is helpful to have these fields such that you could specify something like that. Same case for Istio's waypoints in the ambient architecture. There's a possibility that if it were to support like multiple implementations beyond just the stock one that ships with the mesh product, that having a way, the high level interface might gloss over it, but having a low level way to configure some integrated thing that is Gateway API compatible to specify what certificates it's using to initiate that TLS from the gateway to a in-mesh backend service is kind of the two use cases that I see us having.
That's actually why I'm kind of interested in the gateway to backend server cert validation Yagni, because
Yeah.
we might actually need that. It might be that we're going to need that, but yeah, I feel like there's a fair amount of discussion that still has to happen about that, but
Yes, and to be clear, what I'm suggesting here with the Yagni ones is that it would exist in at least one place, but the question is if it actually also should be configurable on the backend in this case, or the gateway in this case.
I feel like
But
if what we're considering is allowing the gateway to interoperate with Mesh MTLS, then being able to configure those on the back end or on the gateway is much more useful than configuring them on the back end.
yeah, you very well could be correct.
Well, if you configure it on the back end and you're trying to do it for service mesh, you have to do it for all of the backends as opposed to just one of the gateways, right?
Yep.
So
Yeah, this
Yeah, but you
this
might have
one
some
in
backends not in the mesh though, right? So
I'm sorry, what was that, John?
you could have some backends that aren't in the mesh though, so it can become more confusing. Or are we saying just the validation part, but then you still decide to use
The
TLS or
validation.
not on? Then that's probably
Yeah.
it's
I
good
mean,
for most cases. Yeah.
yeah. Managing a gateway that you want to have in the mesh, but able to talk to backends that are not in the mesh, but you have a mesh, but you want MTLS is going to be interestingly complex. So, yeah. That might, I don't know, that might be a thing where you configure it on the gateway and then you have something on the back end that says, oh, by the way, ignore all that stuff. I don't know. It's, yeah.
Yeah, one thing with the comment about like doing a gateway to the mesh and like the integration point, it's tricky because the mesh stuff tends to actually not just be bog standard TLS. Like
Oh, that depends
Linkerd-
entirely on the mesh.
Right, it depends entirely on the mesh, right? So there's varying degrees. Like Linkerd and Istio both have semantics around expectation for the certificates being spiffy IDs. I don't know if all this is true about Linkerd. It's at least after being spiffy URIs, which is maybe something that's not common outside of mesh. They have specific SNI requirements, which maybe is common or not common. They have specific AOPN requirements. That is the extremely uncommon one. I actually don't know if 100% sure that's true for Linkerd, but I do know for Istio. We have a special AOPN.
Yeah, I don't think that's true for Linkerd. But your point that there may be, that there may be some fairly complex things that you have to configure to get a gateway to fully integrate with a mesh is very well made.
Right. Yeah. So, and it's I commented those two, but I know other meshes as well. I mean, we would all be doing standard TLS if it was if it met all of our needs, right? So we've all found gaps and plugged them in different ways that makes things very complicated to do in a universal way. And could the API be extended to meet all those cases? Probably could meet all of the cases that people hear, but then we're adding all this complexity to meet all these weird edge cases. And is that something the user should think about? Like, I need to go configure all these wonky Istio or Linkerd isms, or something else.
I guess I think that it's maybe not that weird if we have like 3 different implementations that all need it for some reason. And
I mean, being able to configure
hopefully,
ALPN is not that weird.
I think hopefully a user isn't manually configuring a lot of this stuff. Like maybe the capacity to have it configured is useful, and some higher level UX is used to like programmatically configure this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and on that note, I think that one of the most important things we can do as Gateway API is try to make these problems portable, provide portable solutions to them, I guess, for lack of a better term, right?
Can we maybe focus on making the solutions portable instead of the problems?
Sure, yeah, yeah. But what I really mean by that is if it's not the best UX, it's very possible for people to build abstractions on top. Obviously, I've been working with the assumption that Gateway will be the user-facing API that people work with. But it's possible that if a mesh is integrating with something they gloss over, they make it easier to cover some of these points. Like you need to configure these spiffy IDs. Like maybe I can do that for you, as an example.
I think it's not terribly difficult for me to imagine Linkerd actually writing the configuration for TLS for the gateway, right? I mean, I feel confident that some of the engineers will come back and go, dude, we don't want to do that. But it's still not difficult for me to imagine. It's also not difficult for me to see things like if you're configuring a gateway to interact with the mesh, then that may just be that you need to provide it a cert that already has a spiffy ID in its SAN, but that the gateway API might not need to worry about spiffy because all you're doing is pointing it to a cert, right? There's a lot of things like that where some of these things are pretty clear that you should be able to set certificates and you should be able to talk about the validation chain for certificates, but that might not require us to get down into the weeds on all of these service mesh specific things, as long as we just say, here's a certificate, right? I guess we'll see. Overall, I think that there's going to be a fair amount of stuff that we still have to talk about for details on this one, but certainly being able to tell the gateway, here's the certificate you should use when you talk to a backend. Here's the thing that you should expect to see in the trust hierarchy when a backend talks to you. Things like that. That all makes sense. There's a basic level to me that I think is fairly common and straightforward. And maybe it'll be enough, and maybe it won't.
And on that note, maybe what I would say is actually no. Let me back up, because spiffy is something I've spent some time thinking about, and backend TLS policy, the way we've crafted that does not allow for a cert that just has spiffy SANs, because right now we're requiring that SNI match both. Well, SNI match the SAN, and SNI is not a valid spiffy ID. So we'd need to have something like subject names on backend TLS policy, which comes all the way full circle to what Dave had suggested earlier in this discussion of, hey, like this client validation thing suggests maybe we should have subject names here. Maybe we should do the same thing down here. So again, just, as we take this to the next level of like what fields belong in each place, need to think a little bit about what fit. And we don't need to start with everything. We just need to make sure we have room for everything. That's all. Cool. Well, that was great discussion. Appreciate the comments, suggestions, etc. This is meant to be collaborative. Maybe it will eventually get to GitHub in some form. I don't really know the best way to do that yet. This doesn't feel like a gap. We don't really have a good mechanism for this, but just wanted to get some brainstorming going here about the things we might want to have room for and how they might fit in, but very much appreciate feedback around what we might be missing still, and maybe specific fields that we want to make sure are included in each place. Yeah. Cool. All right. Think that's it. Any other things on client cert validation before I move on? All right. The next one then is this session persistence gap. Grant, I think you're on the call, right?
Yep.
Sweet. Okay. Yeah, I know you've pushed a ton of updates to this. I think you've resolved just about all feedback. Do you want to give maybe a quick update on where this is?
Yeah, we've been iterating over some comments. We what have we done? So we dropped we have a policy which was session persistence policy. Now it's changed into backend load balance policy. So and it only targets service, and the route level attachment, I guess, if you will, or route level configuration for test persistence is going to be in line, just like Rob was kind of alluding to earlier. So right now, on the route, we're not exposing the same configuration for system persistence as we are for the service. That was one of Costin's comments. His concerns was exposing certain configuration options for the route, I guess, causes some edge cases. So the service has the load, you have the backend load balancing policy that can target the service that has all the options that we're exposing right now. But the route, you can simply just say turn on excessive persistence. So that's something I would like some review on, that specific item, sort of the route inline configuration, which is sort of that's a new thing for me, a new thing for this KEP.
Yeah, this was I know I'd left some feedback, Gina had left some feedback, Costin had, but others are welcome to as well. But one of I can't remember if it was my recommendation or Gina's recommendation, but I think we both had similar thoughts here that related to that discussion earlier, maybe we shouldn't try to have built-in policy that targets resources we could just have inline configuration for. So instead, if we can do inline configuration, we probably should. Now that is still very open to discussion, as Grant was suggesting, but that's kind of where I landed on that. And I've talked with a few others that seem to agree, and obviously that seems to be the consensus in this meeting so far. But this is the first time we're doing anything like this, where we're using similar configuration at 2 levels, and at 1 level, service or backend, it is policy, and at the other level, it would be inline configuration. So worth some thought, worth some review. I think this GEP is, I just want to hats off to Grant for writing this out. I've spent a bunch of time reading through this, and I missed the initial version of this GEP, giving it a proper review, but suffice it to say that Grant put a lot of time into I'm assuming a lot of time into it, because it's very well written, very, very detailed, and covers a lot of edge cases. So yeah, well done. Man, that is a sweet effect, Flynn. I don't know how you did that, but that's anyway.
You just have to get an M1 Mac is all. It's
okay. I mean, I got that. I just need to figure out, okay, one day.
just do 2 thumbs up and see what happens.
Okay.
Just hold it for a few seconds.
Oh
There you go.
man, I'm missing out. I've been using Meet so long, I didn't know.
It works.
Okay.
It works
Good to know.
everywhere. Works everywhere that your Mac's camera is on.
The
Sweet.
machine is watching your every move, Rob.
Big Brother is watching you.
Oh, that's amazing. That's great. Okay. So yeah, I think this really just needs a little bit more feedback. Right now there's a few of us that have responded on this. I think Shane, you've already given the all clear, so we've got at least 1 approval on this. I'd love to see feedback from 1 or 2 other people before we merge this in, but I'm obviously biased, but I think this one is getting awfully close. Yeah.
Did we talk about, so I still think it might be reasonable to just do one or the other for now, as opposed to trying to do route and service at the same time. I don't necessarily want to stop everything and change it, but just throwing that out there, because I know you and I talked about it, Rob, and I talked about it with Grant, but like just doing one for now seems completely legitimate to me. And then whoever wants to do the other one can kind of pick it up as we go. That might make this move a little bit quicker, because it has, been around for a long time now.
Yeah, no, I completely get that that idea, and I would be totally open to like more than just Grant having to push this forward. Grant, you've done a ton of work here, but I don't feel like it has to just be you. So I would say From the perspective of Google, there's a lot of interest in route attachment from some of our products because, you think of anything that's Envoy based or gRPC based, that's route level attachment, basically, or the equivalent in those systems. But obviously many other products are service or backend based persistence. So it's pretty hard for me to, if we don't support one of those, then you end up with, kind of a less than ideal experience for, let's say, half of the implementations out there. I don't know, I just approximate numbers there. But with that said, my take on that would be I'd definitely be very open to, not requiring everything to be bundled together by one person. Like if we can split up the work or, not make this such a huge piece, I totally get that, because Grant, you've been working on this for a long time and I don't want to just overload you with more complexity. So if you wanted to just focus on one and have someone else focus on the other and kind of just merge efforts, that's great too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it doesn't feel like we're hung up on route just yet. I've kind of got the basis of a framework. I will admit I'm missing the edge cases, and I think there's still stuff we need to work through. But if it's okay in the state that it's in, and there's no major objections, I'm fine with leaving inline route configuration in as it is. But if it becomes a problem,
it's provisional. It's not necessarily, I guess what I was trying to say was less we should do this now and more just like keep it in mind that especially if you don't really have a strong route case yourself, that it's okay to potentially just move forward with the use case that you're close to. But that is, of course, up to you.
yeah, we'll definitely keep that in mind.
But also
Cool.
for everybody reviewing this, keep in mind, this is still, we're not moving this out of provisional yet. We're still in provisional with this PR.
What on that note, what's left between this and implementable in your mind, Shane?
I would really like to see some prototyping for this. We have a prototyping phase that we added, and I think this is a good candidate.
So from here, we go to a PR to add API spec. What would prototyping look like beyond API spec?
I mean, trying it out in an API spec makes sense. I don't think we necessarily add it to the existing API spec or anything. Maybe some interpretation can be had there how you want to do it. But I think prototyping and having a couple implementations just kind of play with it makes some sense for this one. Before we say it's implementable in the sense that like we are going to try to maintain backwards compatibility, I think prototyping is a good phase to like start producing some spec, try it, but basically say we are absolutely not committed to trying necessarily to keep this backwards compatible from here until we move it to implementable.
Well, but isn't
we can talk about the details, I guess.
Yeah, I mean it sounds awfully similar to experimental to me.
Well, I would say so, but we've had the historic problem that experimental has basically been beta. So like I argued for that for the last couple of years that experimental should be exactly that, but that's not how it's like ever worked out. That's kind of why the prototyping phase came to be, I think, if I'm not misremembering our conversations. But I'm open to whatever. I just think getting some people to try it. My only criteria is that we try it, like actually try it out and try to see if we can get some stuff working in a setting where we're very clear that we're like not necessarily moving this. It doesn't have to go forward from here. We're just giving it a shot to work out some of the kinks and find some of those edge cases. How that happens, I actually don't really, doesn't bother me.
Yeah. No, and my own personal opinion is that I really want experimental channel to be that place. I don't want it to feel like beta. I want it to feel like things can still break here, and that's okay. We definitely have that in our guidelines, but like you said, it's a long time since we've actually let something break in there. So it does lend to providing some sense of stability that may not be intended. Yeah, that's worth some more discussion. But I would love to see this get in, but I do want to be respectful and not, not push things before they're ready. Okay, yeah, we can follow up on that. Gateway merging, I just have not had the bandwidth to review this one yet. I don't know if others, I think there's some others that have
Isn't
approved
everyone
this.
doing this some way on their own right now? Like, doesn't just everybody just doing this? Or maybe not everybody.
I mean, maybe it would
And-
be a good thing to get a survey of people that are, because that's probably a good signal for the rest.
Yeah, I'm pretty positive that the team here at Kong does do this or has a mechanism for this right now. So I don't know, like bandwidth is really tight. We're a small company, but I could see us potentially coming back around and helping with this one in time, but it would be really good to get that tally of like, is everybody doing this some way on their own?
I know that Envoy Gateway, I can't remember if it's like in by default or if you have to do something special to allow it, but yeah. Envoy Gateway has definitely run into needing to do this.
It
Yeah,
looks
Rob,
like
you're starting to mention it. I think it's a good idea to kind of have a poll to get that feedback of implementers, how they are addressing merging multiple gateways, and see if there's kind of a standard way that it's being done and get it documented. Is that kind of what this gap is about, right?
Yeah, it's been a while since I've looked at this one, but I am amazed to see just how many people have already signed off on it. It would be very good just to get kind of that breadth of implementations to kind of vouch for this and say that we already do something similar, but we would do this instead, kind of thing, or in addition to. Yeah, what I really hate to see happen here is that we introduce a mechanism, an API, and then everyone keeps on doing their own thing because they already have their own approach or whatever it happens to be. But yeah, some kind of survey or even just chiming in on this, whatever works, would be very helpful here. Okay. Well, I know we are running through time, so let me hand it off to Dave. Yeah, I think you're next.
Yeah, this one's another PSA as last week. It's like I have some new conformance tests for some extended features that never have had tests before. So for those who are reviewers, please review them. Ideally, it'd be nice to backfill them.
Cool. Yeah, no, I have looked at your tests and they look correct to me, but before I personally sign off, I try and take the time to actually run the tests, and that's just I haven't had the bandwidth, but they look right to me. That's what I would say. I would, if anyone else is able to double check these tests, that would also go a long way. But thank you. You're covering a lot of areas that were just kind of well, uncovered, and vulnerability. It's better to have more test coverage here to ensure that we really are providing consistent UX across implementations. Yeah. I think the next person on the agenda is not able to attend the meeting, but they're just asking for an additional review on a Gateway Cuddle PR. Looks like this one just got in pretty recently. A huge thanks to Gaurav, by the way. There's been to Gaurav, but also all the incoming Gateway Cuddle PRs. There's been a lot of action around Gateway Cuddle, and a lot of different contributors jumping in. So huge thanks to everybody that's contributing. And hopefully that means we're going to have a pretty meaningful release for Gateway Cuddle as part of 1.1. So yeah, there's a lot of issues. Gaurav has opened a bunch of tracking issues for different bits of Gateway Cuddle that can be done. So if you're looking for an opportunity to contribute, there are still plenty out there. But yeah, this is great to see all the PRs coming in. I actually do legitimately have slides for this today, but looking at the time, this is not urgent at all. So I think I'm just going to drop it to the end. But sometime when we have room at a meeting, I'll cover what we're working on for reference grant in upstream. So Kubernetes/Kubernetes as a official API. Yeah, this is going to be something that we cover at KubeCon as well. But high level summary is just trying to make reference grant not just a thing that controllers rely on and have to implement, but also something that actually does authorization as well. So that like as an authorizer. So that will be a very interesting project and lots of people working on it. Next up, I think we're right back to you, Dave.
Yeah, I'm kind of just servicing this again. I kind of started this discussion in Case Upstream, where I saw endpoint slices have a type called fully qualified domain name, essentially a byproduct of that functionality, because it wasn't really defined, is Core DNS added the ability to do CNAME records when it reads that stuff. I thought it was something that was expected as an alternative to external name type for Kubernetes services. And I tried to, like, in that issue, prevent it from being deprecated, because there is that use for that. But then I kind of tease out, hey, there was some concerns about the use case I had. But I'm seeing also implementations adding support for fully qualified domain name with endpoint slices, like my gateway now supports it. So I'm just trying to see, like, is there any consensus on whether it should be supported or not? The reason why I'm doing this is because I added a conformance test to exercise different service type backends. This is one that it has some like contention on whether it should be supported or not. I was actually hoping you would cover your reference grant stuff, because then it'd be more like, hey, does reference grant allow could be the mechanism to allow routing to these types of backends? Because essentially people have the use case where, like, hey, we want to route off cluster, and they're using external name and this feature for that. But I don't know if folks have ideas or thoughts on how to unblock that use case of off routing cluster or routing off cluster.
I have many thoughts. FQDN in endpoint slice is one of my many regrets of all time. This was one of those things where we did it just because we were moving from endpoints, which was a very limited and restrictive API, and we thought, oh, endpoint slices could be the future of everything. Think of all the things you could put into this API. And we could have address types. You wouldn't even need to just do IP addresses. You could have FQDN. But this was we could do it, but we didn't have a clear use case for it. It was just, well, like, surely somebody could benefit. So this is showing the flexibility of the API. And never, I regret that. And so what has come out?
There is a use case for it.
I know that. So I know there are use cases for it, I guess, but the thing is, it's not really implementable in kubeproxy anyways. I'll say that.
Yeah.
But maybe as a bigger point, it is very difficult, maybe impossible, to ever do anything like that safely, because you don't know what DNS resolves to, and you don't know, like, again, it depends on what is implementing this. But if the thing that is implementing FQDN support has a different view of the world than you do, you can do a fun confused deputy whatever, where you're saying, hey, why don't you route me over here? I can't get to it, but I know you can. So can you help me out? And whatever that DNS resolves to is where you will go, or whatever, right? And it's there have been fun things where you have something resolved to local host, a loop back, variety of things that end poorly. And it's very hard to defend against all those possible configurations. So my vote is please let's not. But I recognize there are use cases. I just need to be convinced that those use cases can be done for sure safely.
Yeah, I guess I'm not suggesting supporting endpoint slice FQDN, but if, for example, the use case of off-cluster routing, I'm trying to push for an alternative because I don't want to go into a rabbit hole of proposing alternatives and then they just get rejected, versus if there's people who are opinionated about this in the SIG network space upstream as well. That's what I was wondering, like, does reference grant work with this? Like, hey, if I use reference grant as a way to signal, hey, this service is legit, like external name service is approved, can the gateway know that it's trusted? I don't know if the new reference grant stuff does something like that, or maybe it's a new type.
Yeah, it's not in scope yet, but maybe you mentioned off cluster routing, and my immediate thought is, well, I mean, there's multi-cluster service or something like that, which I think is different than what you're referring to. Maybe it'd be useful just to create an issue if you don't already have one that describes the kind of capabilities you want to support, kind of disconnected from FQDN, and maybe FQDN or something like it is the solution, but just even clearly defining the use cases could help us figure out what the solution is. But I think kind of
Gateway API, or should I do that in Kubernetes?
let's start in Gateway API and I see from there. And
Okay.
yeah, and like what John is saying is correct. Like this has a very different meaning if you're in mesh, while in variations where the mesh is basically has the same level of access as you do, it's not as big of a deal. It's more when you're configuring something that has a different level or perspective of access than you have, that this becomes really interesting and dangerous. So we do need to differentiate those because this isn't universally awful. It's just have to be careful. That's yeah. Okay, so I guess the follow-ups on this is we should have some kind of standard comment, whatever, about FQDN support and Gateway API, because it is very risky, in my opinion, and I would suggest avoiding it unless you are very, very confident that you can do it safely. But yes, we're at time, so let me keep on moving. And the other follow-up here is, Dave, that you're going to create an issue that just describes the use cases for off cluster. Yeah. Cool. So I'm going to real quickly cover, well, triage we can get to loop back. Thomas, I think you might be on this call. Maybe we can spend a bit of time on yours.
Yeah, sure. I'm actually like he couldn't make the call, so this is what he has been working on, and I just want to communicate that he updated with the latest, like with that split of the direct and indirect policies. So I think this pull request is kind of done. So we're just wondering if we can move it forward.
Yeah, and yeah, I remember this one now. I think the idea of named route rules is pretty straightforward and simple. The unfortunate thing is that it enables a new form of policy attachment where you have this, and I think you may have already covered it in the gap, but you start to introduce this confusion of, should I be using policy or should I be using a custom filter to extend my route rule, right? So you're like, you've basically opened the door to two different forms of extension for the same thing.
Don't we already have that question, that fundamental tension?
Well, right now there's no way for a policy to target a route rule. So there's only one way to do it in that case. This allows policies to target individual route rules.
Leveling the playing field.
Yeah. Yeah, this deserves review for sure. And I think who's already looked at this? Mike, you've signed off on it. Looks like some others have. Yeah, it would be useful just to see. Yeah, we have not done this justice in terms of review. It would be useful to see other implementations and you know that are interested in this, could benefit from it. You know, I think named route rules are actually useful and a good idea overall. It's just that they happen to have this interaction with what they allow for policy attachment that has you know, like it otherwise it seems like such an obvious thing. Like, well, why wouldn't you be able to name a route rule? I think it is something that we probably invariably need to add at some point. I haven't had a good answer to the, or I haven't personally had a good answer to the extension question.
I
Just
did.
to,
Oh, sorry.
go ahead, Mike.
Oh, I was saying for reviewer context for anybody who is up for taking a look at this, there are notes, and I added the link to the video in the initial discussion where this came up about the interaction with policy attachment and such things. I added those to the notes for, I believe it's January 8th. So yes. January 8th is where this was discussed previously.
Okay.
So there's additional context there for anyone that wants to take another look. Now that Nick's work on revising the policy attachment stuff seems to be in its final stages.
Awesome. That is very helpful. Okay, so that yeah, let me spend some time thinking about that. In the meantime, definitely appreciate any other reviews on this as well. I really appreciate Mikey taking a look at it. But anyone else who you know would directly benefit from this, or would support this, would really be useful to get your feedback on this one sooner than later. Okay, I think we've passed time, so thank you everyone for staying later today. We will see everyone at the later time slot next week, and then hopefully we'll see some of you at KubeCon a couple weeks from now. It's coming up really quickly. Yeah, but all right, thanks everyone. Have a good rest of your week, and we'll see you around.